from the moment I began to write in a serious fashion, I went to Breadloaf 4 times. I went to Kenyon twice with these summer workshops. I met lots and lots of other authors, really began to establish a network with some great, wonderful people who are so supportive and all. Obviously, a measure of success is to be published. I asked a great friend of mine recently. She said, I don't want to be famous. I said, okay, but what do you want out of all this? She says, I want to be read. She says, I want to be well read. I guess that's true, but I'm not going to deny that being published has been a great joy for me, that my work has been considered good enough to appear in the Hudson Review and the Common and the Barcelona Review and elsewhere. It gives me great joy to see, and it gives me great joy to share that with friends and family too, who are all very proud of me. Now, I think I can say that a measure of success is also the doing of it and being in the story. You could ask my wife when I tell her I'm in a story now. I'm into another story. She'll say, "Oh, good." And what I'm saying to her is that I'm deep into it, and there's no time where I'm happier. And if I had to trade, if there was some magical way to trade and say, okay, you'll never be published again, but you will always have that jolt, that joy of being in it and making it happen and knowing you're making it happen. Well, that would be hard to trade away. They're both big successes.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Living the Next Chapter. I have another great author on the podcast on to talk about his journey as an author, and you're going to learn a lot from him. And he's written something that I'm really excited to chat about. This is a book that I'm really excited to get my hands on. It's coming soon, and I'm really anticipating this book. And great conversation today with Bob Johnson on the podcast. Bob, welcome to Living the Next Chapter. Glad to have you here.
Well, thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
Excellent. Bob, tell everybody where you are in this great, big, beautiful world of ours.
I live in South Bend, Indiana, where the Irish have won 6 straight now.
There you go. The Fighting Irish.
The Fighting Irish. They won 6 straight. They had one heartbreaking loss, their second game of the season against Northern Illinois. But since then, they've been pretty tough.
Okay. Well, you can always bet on an Irishman. So I'm from Scotland. My background's Scottish. But Ireland, amazing people. Amazing. That's great.
Yeah.
Good stuff. When did this whole thing about, hey, I think I'm going to be an author. What did this spark up for you? What was that initial spark?
Well, it goes back quite a few years. I was the head resident of a dormitory at the college where I attended. It's Goshen College in Goshen, Indiana. And I knew that I wasn't cut out to be a head resident because I would have preferred to be, three floors above drinking beer with students rather than disciplining them. I bought one of those little books with blank pages, and I began to scribble in it. And I still have that book. It's actually in my office right now, and it has my very first story in it. And that was, I hate to say it, about 50 years ago. And I shared it with friends, the story with friends. I had come back recently from Costa Rica, where as a student, and they had kind of, shall we say, amateur, really ragtag bullfights there, where the bull wasn't killed, but men got into the ring and ran around with the bull and tried to prove their machismo, by avoiding the bull's horns. And I didn't do it. I was 20 and I was capable of just about anything, but I didn't do that. I was too chicken to do that. But I did come home then and became this head resident guy, and I wrote a story about a character who did do it. and was and was killed by the bull. And, it was kind of in my Hemingway phase, I guess. And I shared the story with friends, and they said, "Ooh, that's really interesting. That's really interesting." And I shared it with a professor whose name was Nicholas Lindsay. He's the son of the American poet Vachel Lindsay. And Nick didn't tell me that I was an idiot, and he told me to write the story 7 more times. He said, that's good. I appreciate that. That's fun, and everything. That was an interesting read. It was only a couple of pages long. And he said, okay, now write it 7 more times. And I had no idea what he meant. He was a wild man, a kind of a carpenter poet, and he lived much of the year in Edisto Island off of South Carolina, I think. And he was full of advice like that. Write it 7 more times, he said. And then he said to me, I've never forgotten this. He said to me, get close to her. And I didn't know who her was. I wasn't even an English major. I hadn't taken any of his poetry classes. I didn't know who her was. He said, but get close to her. And I went back and I wrote this story 6, 7 more times. And mostly I wasn't trying to imitate the first story, the bull story. I just went back and I wrote a bunch more stories, and I hoped that somehow I'd land magically on who her was. And I know now. Nick was deeply into maybe the Mary myth. Her was the earth, the fecundity of existing, of the earth, the darkness, and he wanted me to tap deeper. He recognized that I was trying to do some macho thing, some exclusively male thing, and he wanted me to perhaps broaden my perspective, broaden my search, perhaps. He said, get close to her. I was maybe 24 years old, and as I say, I wasn't an English major. I hadn't even read very much, but I had this impulse to write, and that's what started it all. And I wrote and wrote and wrote from there until I finally he finally urged me to go to a writers' conference at Indiana University of South Bend, where I ran into several other writers. It was kind of heady for me because I hadn't ever been considered a writer. And next thing you know, I'm going to the writers' conference at Indiana University in Bloomington. And so that's the beginning of the story. I mean, I could tell you the entire trek from then to now, but I figured you'd want to break in with some questions. I don't know.
Sure. Yeah, I love doing that. Okay, so now let's take a pause. Like, we have authors listening who are at the beginning of their journey.
Yes.
As you were.
Yes.
In that story. They're looking to you now as a published author, going, what kind of advice do you have for somebody brand new to writing? How could you give them that word of encouragement? To you, it was follow her, get close to her in the story. What's your advice now to a new author?
Well, my advice is a whole lot more practical than Nick Lindsay's was. I wouldn't tell a new writer, get close to her. I'm not going to say I almost said I still don't quite know what he meant, but I do in a way, in my heart, in my writer's heart, I do. But it's hard to talk about, hard to understand. What I would tell writers to do, beginning writers, if they feel that spark, that urge, is to just do it and do it and do it and do it and harangue your friends. Ask your friends to read what you've written. Ask them how it touched them, what it meant to them. Perhaps ask them to read it aloud back to you. Perhaps ask because you'll hear things perhaps that you didn't intend. But harangue your friends. Write and write and write. Get it down. Don't listen to the monkey on your back that says it's no good. Get it down, get it down, get it down. Um, and then, of course, revise and revise and revise. Um, every single word matters. One thing I would say, a teacher one time said to me, if a character buys a tomato at the beginning of your story and kills his father at the end of your story, then you ought to be able to say that he killed his father because he bought a tomato. The notion being that there is no that every single word matters, and every single word is going toward a goal. Now, I used to interpret that as a kind of a advice to know the ending of my story before I began it. And I used to occasionally find myself writing the last sentence of a story before I began the story, and then aiming toward that end. And I'm not saying that's entirely bad, maybe especially at the beginning. But of course, you have to always leave yourselves open for surprises too, because your characters will end up doing things that you didn't expect them to do. But I get going back to your original question, do it, do it, do it. Ask your friends to read it. Ask them to respond as bluntly as they can. And then do it again, and then do it again, and then do it again. Write it 7 times. 7 times 70, I think the Bible says 70 times 7. Yeah. I think that's as many times as you're supposed to forgive someone, 70 times 7, I think Jesus said.
Right. Yeah.
And so write it 7 and maybe 70 times 7, and go where it goes. Don't be afraid. Don't listen to the monkey on your back.
You shared an interesting story with me where you went out with some friends, and there was some nuts involved when you guys were out having drinks and just socializing. And there's a tie-in between a handful of nuts and you as a writer. I think this is a great story that people would really love to latch onto. Bob, can you tell us this little story and how this impacted you as a writer?
Well, that happened many, many years later. That happened after I began to write. I began to go to writers' conferences and the like. I ended up going to Iowa, and then the Iowa Writers Workshop, that is, and then I got a job in I got married. I had children. I got divorced. I got a job in local television in South Bend, and I was never a multitasker. And my job was extremely, extremely demanding, where I had 30 odd people that reported to me, and my job was to hire and fire people and to make budgets and do all that stuff. And the notion of coming home and writing at night, or getting up first thing in the morning and writing before I went to work, it was absolutely impossible for me. And we can talk about that. I could talk about that a long time because I've always been sort of ADHD. And now that I know what ADHD is, I kind of forgive myself. But back in the day, I just thought I was lazy and couldn't focus, and what was wrong with me. But when I finally retired, and I wanted to start writing again. And every time a New Year's Eve came around, my wife would say, what are your resolutions? And I say, I want to write. I want to write again. I want to write, because the bug was never gone. It never left me. But finally, I'm sitting with friends in a bar after I'd retired, and I'm lamenting to them that I hadn't started writing again. Here I am. I have the freedom to do so, and I'm still not writing. And a young friend whose name was Josh Taylor, there was a bucket of unshelled nuts between us, and he picked up a handful of those nuts and said, write about these nuts. And it was sort of a prompt. I didn't, it just hit me. It hit me like ton of bricks, as it were, or in this case, I guess a ton of nuts. And I went home and I wrote a story called These Nuts. And that story was actually recently published in a magazine called Bull Lit. And I never stopped. It was the prompt I needed to get started again. And if you think about my first story, or the bullfight story, that's when I was 23 or so. And this urging by this young friend of mine, Josh, to write about these nuts, there was 40 years in between, which is kind of difficult to absorb, I suppose, for young writers. Although I would say that anyone considering writing, or anything, I'd say let my story be a guide that it's never too late. Because I picked it up again with These Nuts, and I've never stopped. And here I've got a book coming out.
That's amazing.
Yeah, which continues, never ceases to astonish me that I'm publishing a book after all that time.
That's great. Do you think that what is one advantage of a 40-year gap, and what is one disadvantage of a 40-year gap as a writer?
Well, I could again talk in purely mercenary practical terms about the disadvantage. The disadvantage, it seems to me, and there'll probably be listeners out there that will tell me, "Oh, cry some more, old man, cry some more, boomer," about it. But the disadvantage is that I kind of grew out of being, how do I say it, marketable. I mean, I was an old, a white male from the middle of the country. And so a disadvantage, perhaps, is that I kind of grew out of my attractability, because if I had been doing all that, the work I'm doing now as a 25-year-old, I would have been an up-and-comer, if you know what I mean, and would have been the next new thing. Well, it's kind of hard to be the next new thing when you're 65, and especially maybe when you are my gender, my ethnicity, my age, from the middle of the country. You're not the next new thing. You're the old thing. You're who did it for generations upon generations in American literature, world literature, and now it's somebody else's turn. Because I couldn't have been more normal, if you know what I mean. I had an agent for a while who tried very hard to sell the collection to the big publishers, and it didn't happen, but we split on good terms. I asked her one time, should I be like R. Lawrence Johnson? Should I be R.J. Johnson? And she says, no, you're Bob Johnson, because she liked the brand. She liked the Midwestern old guy that picked it up again. She thought that was kind of cool. But in answer to your question, I think I just covered maybe the disadvantages. I grew out of my having a kind of a cachet attached to me. The advantages are, almost, I think you could come up with them. Anyone listening could come up with them. You've lived a life. There's so much more to write about. You're more seasoned. You're smarter. I don't care what anybody says. You get smarter as you get older. You get wiser. You get you get broader. You get more empathetic. You understand better why someone would say what they said. You perhaps wouldn't get as how shall I say? You wouldn't be perhaps as irked or peeved by someone saying something kind of terse or unpleasant. You might have an empathy about why in their circumstance would they say such a thing. So I think that's the advantage, the big long life that you've lived. And in my case, anyway, I became more disciplined. I talked about being ADHD, and I still am. But I now have the luxury of time, and I have the luxury of an office space and a wife who is 100,000% behind me and leaves me alone when it's my time to write. And of course, I didn't have those things when I was younger because I was working, working, working. I was working my head off and grinding away at making a living. So I guess that would be the advantage of my time now, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm. One more question around the author's side of what you're doing. I've asked this of other authors. I get a variety of answers to this. But what is your measurement of success as an author? As this book comes out into the world, as people start buying it, how are you tracking success? What does that mean to you?
Boy, that's a hard one. Um, I certainly, from the moment I began to write in a serious fashion, I went to Breadloaf 4 times. I went to Kenyon twice, these summer workshops. I met lots and lots of other authors, really began to establish a network with some great, wonderful people who are so supportive and all. Um, Obviously, a measure of success is to be published. I asked a great friend of mine recently. She said, I don't want to be famous. I said, okay, but what do you want out of all this? She says, I want to be read. She says, I want to be well read. Um, I guess that's true, but I'm not going to deny that being published has been a great joy for me, that my work has been considered good enough to appear in the Hudson Review and the Common and the Barcelona Review and elsewhere. It gives me great joy to see, and it gives me great joy to share that with friends and family too, who are all very proud of me. Now, I think I can say that a measure of success is also the doing of it and being in the story. You could ask my wife when I tell her I'm in a story. I'm in a story now. I'm into another story. She'll say, "Oh, good." And what I'm saying to her is that I'm deep into it, and there's no time. There's no time where I'm happier. And if I had to trade, if there was some magical way to trade and say, "Okay, you'll never be published again, but you will always have that jolt, that joy of being in it and making it happen and knowing you're making it happen." Well, that would be hard to trade away. Um, well, they're both big successes.
Okay. The book is coming out, I see here on Amazon, February 11th, 2025 is the date they have showing.
Yes.
But talk about the Continental Divide. I'm really interested to introduce this to readers because that's the big part of our audience here is they're looking for their next favorite author. They may never write a book, but they're looking to fall in love with you as an author. Tell us about the Continental Divide. How did this one come to light for you?
Well, I began. I found myself writing again and again stories that took place in a mythical town in northern Indiana called Mount Moriah. And Mount Moriah is in the Bible, I believe, it's where Abraham took Isaac to sacrifice him, and God spoke to him, and Isaac was spared. Um, it There's a church outside of Goshen, Indiana, where I used to live. That's called Mount Moriah, and I've always felt that the name has such resonance with me, and so I found myself writing stories about a mythical town, which obviously was very much like my own hometown, which is Middlebury, Indiana. And next thing you know, it's coming together into a collection. All the stories are fitting, and next thing you know, certain characters are recurring. There is a marshal of Mount Moriah whose name is Johnny Baker, and Johnny Baker occurs in a handful of the stories. And even when he isn't named, there is a young marshal in the background. So I would say the collection isn't exactly linked, like, say, Olive Kittredge is a linked, collection, but it is nevertheless all from the same milieu, the same farms and Mennonite and Amish farms, and the same sense of perhaps a kind of a toxic masculinity that pervades, the Midwest, the middle of our country. Well, of course, anywhere in the world where men and women meet and struggle. And I finally was driving near South Bend, where I live, and we happened right through where I live is the St. Lawrence Continental Divide, where a drop of rain on the north side goes to Lake Michigan, and a drop of rain on the south side of the divide goes to the Gulf of Mexico. And it struck me that I had the idea as I was driving of an old woman who lives smack dab on the Continental Divide, the St. Lawrence Divide, where she looks out over the southern hills to where moss and grows in trees and copperheads hang from branches, copperhead snakes, and old ladies dance to voodoo music. And she looks to the north where there's a great blue lake where eagles pluck salmon from the water. And even though, she wouldn't see those, but she would have a sense that those things are there on either side of this divide where she lives. And it struck me as a great location for a story. And as time went by, that became the collection's name. And even though the Continental Divide is not mentioned in any of the other stories, the divide between men and women, and between sin and redemption, and between heaven and hell are always discussed, probably as they are in all fiction, but in this case, the Continental Divide. I'm a Midwest writer. I think I always will be. I'm not going to write about living in Paris because I don't live in Paris. I live where I live, and I write about the people of my world, and it's all I can do. My sister one time told me that I should write about Barcelona, and what she meant was that perhaps you should move out of your particular. She was talking about stories that had something to do with my family, and she said, "You got to write about more than just that. You've got to write about Barcelona." And I think that she's satisfied now that I am writing about Barcelona, because I am writing about more than things that happened to me. Like the old lady story living on the Continental Divide is a completely made up character. I don't know her in my life. She doesn't come from Middlebury, Indiana. She's an absolute invention, if you know what I mean. So I believe that my sister Beth would say that I have begun to write more about Barcelona than just within the confines of my own home, if you know what I mean.
Nice. So each kind of talk us through the structure of the book as well. Like how does all the everything map out, the chapter wise and stuff for the reader? Like, what do we need to know about the Continental Divide before we pick it up?
Oh, they're individual stories, and they don't follow, in my view, much of an arc, though they do perhaps follow a time arc. The Continental Divide is the first story in the collection, and although, as I say, the Marshal Johnny Baker isn't named, he is mentioned as the town's new young marshal. Well, at the final story in the book, Johnny Baker is in his 50s. And so I would say that the stories happen from perhaps the mid-60s up until, well, one of the stories at the end is when Obama is elected president. So there is perhaps an arc that covers a handful of decades across this Mount Moriah and across this section of the country. So, but they're individual stories, and not all of them feature Johnny Baker and some characters that you come to kind of recognize. A handful, actually maybe more than half, are about characters that are not mentioned again. So in that respect, it's not a linked story, but a linked collection rather. But I would say that it's linked in terms of the individual struggles and the Midwesternness of it. I've talked about it being kind of Midwestern noir. People have talked about being, because there's crime, there's violence, there's violence toward women. I won't say that it's exclusively so, but men's attitudes toward women are discussed, and it's not always attractive, of course, as it wouldn't be. So I suppose that's one thing I could tell the readers to be ready for.
Okay. And is there a main takeaway that you're hoping that readers connect with as they read your book?
Well, E.J. Levy, who was the author of a wonderful novel called The Cape Doctor, in one of the blurbs for the book, she said, moments of darkness and surprising grace. And I'm hoping that it's that. I hope that there is grace. The stories are not easy, but there is light in the story, but the light is hard earned. At the end of the final story, a woman is considering the fact that her son is being hunted for murder, and her husband, Johnny Baker, is the man hunting their son for murder because he's the marshal. And she's arguing with herself that if the son is found and if he comes home, things will be different. Johnny Baker will be easier on him. There will be love in the family. There will be Johnny will finally recognize that the son has more to him than perhaps Johnny Baker realized, and things were going to be different. They're going to be different. And then I won't give away the ending, but there is a sound at the very end that sounds to her like a cold, rebuking bell. She's rebuked. She's rebuked by life, by the universe, because, of course, the predictions that she made in her heart didn't come true. Well, I would say that a takeaway of the collection is that there are hard truths, but there is also light to be had, and in a handful of the stories, that bears out as well. Somebody once told me that fiction is about the moral ambiguity of surviving, the moral ambiguity of living life. And I guess that's what I hope people take from it. I hope people take from the stories that they're true. And I don't mean factually true in their representation of life. And also, I hope people take from the stories that they're page turners. I mean, I had a professor at Iowa that said to me that every story you write, the reader should say, "Oh my God, what happens next? Oh my God, what happens next?" That's what I always try to do. I don't wander into philosophy. If there is a worldview, the worldview is represented by my characters and what happens to them, not by anything that this omniscient narrator wants to discuss very much, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's great. As you look forward to the book coming out in February, I know you're out there promoting. You've got some people in your corner helping you to do that. For the authors listening again, let's go back to them for a second. Any suggestions from your perspective on promoting your book for the first time? Anything that's working for you that you're that you would encourage other authors to consider when they get their book out in the world?
Well, I've created a website, bobjohnsonwriter.com. Let me say that again, bobjohnsonwriter.com, where you can pre-order the book.
Sounds good.
I have, as I've said, I've attended these workshops, and I have myself a broad network of friends, and I don't know to what degree this is going to help sell my book, but I've gotten blurbs from some very good writers. In the book, Bonnie Jo Campbell, who recently wrote The Waters, which is a wonderful novel. E.J. Levy, Donald Ray Pollock, who is the writer of a Midwestern Gothic collection called Knock 'em Stiff. It's about a town in Ohio. He actually has been sort of an inspiration to me. His stories are very rough. They're rougher than mine are. But that would be one thing. Also, so the website, the finding yourself champions and mentors, people that are happy to help you, people that are happy to blurb for you and to recommend you. And of course, I use social media. I promote it on Facebook, all I can. Probably to the point that I'm kind of bugging, people, but you got to kind of be a little aggressive about it, especially in the pre-order phase. When there will be a launch event in Stevens Point, Wisconsin, which is where the publisher Cornerstone Press is located. But after that, there will also be launches and readings around this area that a publicist is helping me arrange. It's a publicity team called K Publicity. So I'm pulling out the stops. I mean, I'm probably I don't know this for a fact, but I'm going to guess that I'm probably only going to do this once as far as a collection goes. Maybe I'll write more, write another collection. I don't know. But I'm pulling out all the stops, and I'm trying very hard to promote the book with by any means necessary.
Excellent. And adding podcasting to the mix. I love having you here.
Adding podcasting, which is a lot of fun. I haven't hired a hot air balloon yet, but, it's not out of the realm of possibility.
Well, if you do, things are looking up if you do hire a hot air balloon.
Oh, yeah. For sure. I see what you did there. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
There you go. Bob, so people are going to buy the book in February. Tell us before we go, Bob, how important is it for you as an author to read a review from one of your readers? What makes a good review to you? What kind of information helps you?
Oh, my. I mean, of course, I have an editor and I have lots of friends that read my work. And the best review they give me, besides, "Oh, God, this was wonderful, Bob. Don't change a thing." That rarely happens, by the way. The best my wife is an excellent reviewer too, in that she'll look up from a story and she'll say, "I don't get it," and what she means by that is that you didn't draw all the strings together. I don't quite believe this character would do that. I don't quite believe. I kind of need a bigger payoff. I kind of need. Listen, you mentioned at the beginning X, and then X never reappears, and that sort of felt like it was hanging for me. I mean, it's the old stuff. If you've heard of Chekhov's gun, Chekhov said that if there's a gun at the beginning of the story, then the gun should be fired at the end of the story. I need advice like that. So that's what I would look for sure.
Excellent.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and for the readers, when you buy Bob's book, make sure you do leave a great review, because people do read those reviews. We look at them when we buy something on a website. We're like, is it a good product? Is it a good service? We're always looking for kind of confirmation we're on the right spot and this is the right thing for us. So when you leave a review for Bob's book, please let people know why you love it. Like, what is it about the book that spoke to you?
Absolutely.
And so that other people can make that decision as well.
I would be very grateful.
For you.
Yeah, for sure.
Right. We can do that for you as an author, and I love that.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Bob, my podcast is Living the Next Chapter. So I have to ask as we wrap up, for you, what is your next chapter? What do you, as the book comes into the world, What's next? What are you going to work on?
Well, I'm writing all the time still. I write every day. I drive my wife crazy by how much I write, and I'm continuing to write and submit. I don't know if a novel is in my world because, again, I go back to the ADHD thing. I don't know if you ever heard the quote from Flannery O'Connor. She wrote when she moved from writing novels to short stories, it was like leaving a dark forest for a clearing only to be set upon by wolves. And so, but I will continue to write short stories, I know. And we'll see what happens.
Excellent. So we can follow your journey through your website and through your socials and all that. Bob, it's great to have you on the show.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Congratulations on the book, everyone. February 11th. You can pre-order right now, which is great. And definitely go to Bob's website. We'll have a link for that in the show notes. Connect with Bob. And again, leave it an amazing review. Let Bob know what you thought of his book. Bob, thank you so much for writing this.
I thank you. I appreciate it. It's been a lot of fun.
Hey, thanks for being here for the Living the Next Chapter podcast. So glad to have you as part of our family of listeners. There's a seat for you just here on Living the Next Chapter, and I'm so happy that you have listened to all the way to the end. Wow, you are now my new bestie. I want to let you know that I host 7 other podcasts on top of Living the Next Chapter. Yep, 8 total. One of them is called the How To Podcast series. If you are thinking, you know what, Dave, this podcast thing seems like a lot of fun, well, I'll give you a secret. It is. It's a great, amazing, fun time where you can get to meet great people, get your word out there, promote your book, promote what your coaching program, whatever you're doing. Podcasting is great. And if you want to learn how to do this, what you're hearing right now, head over to howtopodcast.ca and look up the How to Podcast series on YouTube. Whatever app you're listening on, you'll find me there. And I'd love for you to come listen to how to do this. And if you're interested and have questions on how to podcast, reach out to me at howtopodcast.ca. Thank you for listening. Talk soon.